Thank you very much. I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback here, so if anybody else has a microphone on the Skype call, if they could. Okay, that's better, no feedback. Thank you. Bonjour à tous. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, and I'm also sorry that this came up. That means that I'll have to leave very promptly. So I'll say a few words, and then I have great faith in my fellow panelists to raise many of these very important issues. So I want to share with you just a little bit about Fair Voting BC and really what we're currently working on and some of the strategic approaches that we are taking that seem to be resonating with various kinds of people. So to my knowledge, Fair Voting BC is the oldest organization in the country that is specifically focused on electoral reform. We were founded about 20 years ago after a particularly distressing election result in which the party that had received the greatest fraction of the vote share in fact lost the election. And that party was the Liberal Party of British Columbia, and some of our original founders worked pretty closely with the leader, the then leader of the party, Gordon Campbell, and secured from him, first of all, the understanding that this defeat that he experienced had something to do with our voting system, and then his agreement that should he be elected the next time around, as he was in 2001, that he would institute a new approach to reevaluating our voting system. That ultimately led to the BC Citizens Assembly on Electoral Reform, which was convened throughout 2004. It led to a referendum in 2005, which secured 58% support, but the government had decided that they would not feel bound by that result unless the vote in favor had reached 60%. Recognizing the irony of that situation, they ended up running a second referendum, which is a great object lesson for all democratic reformers. In 2009, the motion went down by over 60% against. And I could spend a whole hour talking to you about why that was so, but I think I'll just leave it that referenda are very dangerous, and we should think very carefully before any sort of endorsement of that approach. Current action, so Fair Voting BC is of course very heavily involved in the current Canadian electoral reform committee process, which is happening at the federal level. We've been collaborating closely with Fair Vote Canada on creating shared and complementary submissions to the Commission. We're involved in attending a number of town halls. Sometimes we're being asked to speak, other times we're making submissions there. In Vancouver right now, there's an election task force which is being commissioned by the city, which has basically arisen in response to, it was initiated back about, in 2004, there was a judge-led electoral reform commission that made a number of recommendations, including ones aimed at removing some legislative obstacles to voting reform. And City Council has unanimously asked for the province to make the necessary changes to our city charter over at least 5 times, and been either ignored or turned down on every one of those occasions. So the current election task force is an attempt to try to raise the pressure on the province, I think, by City Council. And I'm sitting on that election task force right now, and we will be making a number of recommendations, including there's, I think, unanimous agreement amongst the task force that we should be moving towards proportional representation at the city level. There's also a new organization that we're partnering with called 123 Vancouver, which is following the success of the ranked ballot initiative people in Ontario to get legislation there allowing cities and towns to choose to adopt ranked ballot voting, whether in single member or multi-member ridings. So in effect, Ontario towns now have the ability to choose the single transferable voting system, which is a form of proportional representation. We find that very, very exciting. I know you'll be hearing from the person from Prince Edward Island shortly, so I won't say anything much more about that. One of the things I wanted to share with you is that in much of the discussion about the need for electoral reform, the strategy seems to be to try to make a case that our current voting system is unfair or has somewhat negative impacts on our public life, and that there are better ways of doing things. And so proportional representation is presented as, to some extent, a matter of fairness, or that it has the potential to improve societal performance in some way. And I just wanted to comment that in our experience, while those sorts of arguments are often related to the reasons why people become aware of electoral reform in the first place, they tend to be very weak in terms of public argumentation, because for everybody who says that a proportional system will make decision-making more consensual, you will find somebody who will say it will turn us into Israel or Italy with factionalized fighting and chaos in government. So we found that it's much more useful to start any discussion about the need for electoral reform by grounding it in a charter rights perspective. And I think here we look a lot to the U.S. And their Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights era in the U.S., where it was very clearly perceived that in attempts to stop people from voting were directly related to civil rights violations. And I don't think we really have that sense here in Canada, but I think we should. It's a very powerful framing. And I would strongly encourage anybody involved in electoral reform to look very closely at a couple of the cases that Justice Beverly McLaughlin has written. There was one in 1986, Dixon v. BC, and then there was the Saskatchewan Boundaries Reference case in 1991. And in those two cases, our Chief Justice has very fully and accurately defined the concept of effective representation, which says essentially that every citizen is entitled to a voice in the deliberations of government, and not merely to vote. So this ties into our Section 3 right to vote, it ties into our Section 15 right to equality. And so I think that the more that we cast this whole question as a matter of a violation of our charter rights, I think the firmer ground we're on, the more resonance we get when we speak with the public. And for those of you who are not from Canada, we adopted a Charter of Rights and Freedoms about 30 years ago. And so this helps to counter the argument that we've always been doing it this way, what could possibly be wrong with the way we're voting? The argument in response is we have a new set of rights, and those rights are being violated. It just hasn't been tested in court yet. So I think I'll mainly leave it there. I appreciate what the first speaker said about the importance of becoming allied, and I know that there is the Every Voter Counts Alliance in Canada right now. There's also the Democracy Action Network, which is more a communications tool and less an activism or a concentrated campaign. But I think that's very important. And I think one of the big challenges overall that we face is that democratic reform is for most people what I would consider a meta issue. It's not the top of mind issue. People are concerned about the environment, about education, about jobs, and they need to be brought to see the connection between the way we govern ourselves and the way that and the implications that has for the issues they actually care about. And so I think a wide range of other civil society organizations are our natural partners in all of this. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and might be able to take one or two questions before I have to rush off.
Salut Hudson, donc de Fair Voting British Columbia.